so as Delia said in the title, my talk is Doing Enough. And I'd like to start just by situating the talk in the broader context of a book project that is in its infancy. But the thing that I want to talk to you about today is meant to be a part of this larger project, which is a book called Striving. Sorry, just one second. I need to, there we go. So this is a project that I'm carrying out with Jennifer Morton at Penn. And essentially what we're interested in is a form of agency that we undertake in the face of uncertainty about what will come of our efforts. Okay, so a lot of the work in the philosophy of action, I think, for very good reasons, focuses on cases of agency where we exercise more or less full control over some rather simple sort of short-term action. Many of the classic examples are things like flipping a light switch or taking a cookie from a plate or resisting the urge to take the cookie. But a lot of our agency is directed at much more long-term, difficult goals that we're uncertain we'll be able to achieve. Partly because we are uncertain about our own abilities. You know, we try to do things like have high-powered careers or long-term relationships. We attempt to achieve great athletic accomplishments or artistic accomplishments. And when we set out, we may lack the knowledge of what we'll have the ability to do. We've never done anything like it before. Okay, and so along the way, as we pursue these kinds of projects, we get more evidence. We get evidence about what we'll be able to do. And we also get evidence about what our opportunities will be like and what kinds of obstacles we're going to face. But until you accomplish the goal, as long as substantial uncertainty persists about whether you're going to be able to achieve the outcome, the agent always faces a choice. Should I persevere or should I give up? Right? Should I keep going in the face of difficulty, in the face of uncertainty about whether I'll be able to pull it off, or should I give up and pursue some other option that might be more feasible? And it's that last bit that I want to talk about today, the choice to give up. So let me try to be a bit more specific about the kind of case that I'm interested in. So imagine an agent who has undertaken to do something difficult. We'll call it action A. Maybe it's to get married and to stay married for life. Or maybe it's to become a philosophy professor or a stand-up comedian. I'm not going to try to be specific here about whether we're talking about intentions or plans or merely some goal or end. But in some sense, the agent has sort of undertaken to do A and then gives up before she's accomplished her goal. So what could be going on in this kind of case? So here's some possible explanations. So one thing that happens is that we give up because we've undergone a stable change in view about the relative value of doing A, right? Such that you now prefer to do something else or to do nothing instead, right? So let's pick a specific example. Maybe you've undertaken to finish a manuscript in the next month and send it out for review. Okay. One thing that might happen is that some other opportunity comes up in the meantime, something else you could be doing in that next month that's more important. Maybe you get the opportunity to organize a symposium and you think, now I would rather spend this time doing that at the expense of finishing my manuscript. So I'm going to give up on my goal of finishing the manuscript in the next month. Okay, so that's one thing that can happen. You can change your mind about what goal to pursue. Another thing that can happen is that you encounter a temptation to do something else instead, or to give up, that you can't resist, right? So in this kind of case, you don't change your mind about the value of your goal. You continue to think that all things considered A is what you ought to do, but you become tempted to do something else instead. So maybe you continue to think that you ought to finish your manuscript in the next month, but on each occasion when you could be working on it, you succumb to temptation to watch Netflix or do anything other than work on the manuscript. And eventually it might come to a point where you're forced to give up. A third kind of case is one in which you neither change your mind about the value of the goal nor encounter a temptation to do something else instead. So you kind of continue to be clear-eyed about wanting to do A, but you're prevented from persisting. You can't go on, right? Maybe your computer dies and you can't work on your manuscript as much as you'd like to, or I don't know, maybe you're struck ill, right? And you simply can't do it. So you can be prevented from persisting. And then there's a fourth kind of case. This is a case where, again, you continue to want to do A more than the alternative. So there's no change of mind about the value of the goal. And you can keep trying, or you believe that you can, but you decide to give up because you're too uncertain of success, right? And you start to think, perhaps this is a waste of my time. I should be doing something else instead that's more feasible. And that's the case that I want to focus on today. So I want to set case D apart from the others and really focus on the case where we're holding fixed, that you continue to value the goal more than any alternative. And the reason you give up is that you're uncertain about your prospects. Okay, so the question that I'm interested in concerns giving up too soon. In virtue of what might it be the case in example D, that the agent gave up prematurely, such that we want to say she should have exerted more effort to achieve her goal. She gave up too soon. She should have kept trying. She should have persisted. We do make these judgments, I think. We sometimes think that people lack persistence, they lack grit, or in a particular instance, they threw in the towel too early. But in virtue of what could that be the case? What grounds claims of that sort? And although I think we could really be thinking about any goal, big or small, but the ones that I'm most interested in are ones that have a kind of long-term significance for our lives, such that we might be haunted by the question afterwards, right? So think about the decision to give up on a marriage, or an athletic or artistic ambition. I have this little bit about running track. Back in the day, I used to be a serious runner, and at some point, I decided to give up on doing that. And the question haunts me a little bit. Did I give up too soon? Should I have put more effort into my track career? Right. And so when that kind of question arises for the agent, right, what I'm interested in is trying to understand what kinds of considerations go into answering it. Right? What kind of considerations could ground the idea that either, yes, it was the right time to give up, or you gave up too soon, or you kept going too long. Okay. So, of course, in many cases, the answer to the question, or one answer to the question, is going to appeal to external expectations and norms and moral pressures on us. So, for example, if somebody decides to give up on a marriage, they might be charged with giving up too soon. And there, the charge might be grounded in the promise or the vow that was made, right? Or in moral obligations more generally that arise in the context of building a life together with another person. Okay, so there are going to be lots and lots of external factors. By external, I mean kind of external to the agent's point of view or what she cares about. What I'm going to try to do is set those aside if possible. And that's difficult to do because I think our intuitions about these cases are really infused with our thinking about these more external norms and expectations. But what I'd like to get at is the agent's own perspective and what, if anything, could ground the idea that, like, I gave up too soon on some project by my own lights relative to some standard that I set for myself. Okay. So of course, I'm going to start by considering two quick responses to this kind of question. And I'm going to argue that both of those responses are inadequate, of course. And then I'm going to try to offer some alternative suggestions. So the first thought, which we get from decision theory or rational choice theory more generally, is that, look, as long as we're holding fixed the value of the achievement to the agent, so as long as we're holding fixed, whatever the utility that she assigns to this particular endeavor, and we price in the costs of the pursuit, including the opportunity costs of continuing to pursue goal A and therefore not being able to pursue other goals or use your resources in other ways. As long as we price all of that in, then the only thing remaining to look at are the odds of success, right? We look at how likely it is that the agent will succeed in what she's trying to do, and that will determine whether she should persist. Okay. So here's an initial worry about this way of thinking about it. I think it's not clear in a lot of these cases that there are going to be uniquely correct probabilities to assign given the evidence. We're thinking about attempts to accomplish something often far in the future, right? Where the agent doesn't have a lot of evidence about what she'll be able to do and what kinds of obstacles will stand in her way. Okay. Her own agency will make a difference to what happens. And so it's not merely a case of kind of looking at the evidence and making a prediction that's independent of what she decides to do. And more generally, we might think it's not just a matter of uncertainty about the future. We might also think, and I'm very taken by this thought, that evidence is often permissive in the sense that a certain body of evidence doesn't uniquely compel a particular conclusion that any rational thinker must arrive at given the evidence. I think there will often be more than one rationally permissible conclusion one can draw from the evidence, maybe because people have different priors, or we can go into why that might be. But if you think that evidence is often permissive, then it's possible that different agents might take different views about what the odds are and what the evidence suggests. Or it's even possible that a single agent might have multiple perspectives open to her. And so it's not going to be enough just to point to something called the odds of success, as if those are always going to be objective and determinate. So that's one worry that we might have about this way of looking at it. A second worry is that even if we do assign the same odds in two cases and hold fixed the alternatives and hold fixed the values of the relative goals the relative values of the goals, excuse me, our judgments can still differ, suggesting that the odds aren't doing all the work. So here, let's look at two examples that are offered to us by Barry Marusic in a forthcoming paper called No Grit Without Freedom. So Barry asks us to think about two agents. One is the gritty graduate student, and the other is the gritty gambler. The gritty graduate student persists in her efforts to publish a paper in a prominent journal in her field, despite repeated setbacks. Analogously, the gritty gambler persists in his efforts to win the jackpot at a slot machine. And we may suppose, not entirely unrealistically, that the odds of publishing an article in a prominent journal in philosophy are similar to the odds of winning the jackpot at a slot machine. So again, I have my doubts about whether it actually makes sense to talk about the odds in the same way in both of these cases. But even if we do, Barry suggests that the gritty graduate student might well be rational in her persistence. It might make sense for her to keep going, but the gritty gambler is likely not. And of course, we'd have to fill in more details to make those judgments for sure. But the point is that our intuitions can differ. And I agree with Barry that there's something going on here that isn't captured just by the assignment of odds and saying there's a 5% chance of success in each case. So let's look at Barry Marusic's suggestion for what the difference is. He suggests that the difference lies in whether success is up to you. The idea is essentially that winning the lottery or winning the jackpot at a slot machine is not up to you in the relevant sense. There are certain things that are up to you, which is whether you continue to pull the lever and so forth. But whether pulling the lever results in winning the jackpot is not something that's up to you. It's not within the purview of your agency. But he says that your efforts will make a decisive difference in publishing the paper. And so publishing a paper in a prominent journal is up to you. Again, not entirely. The idea is not that somehow you can make it so just by deciding, but your efforts will make a decisive difference. We can hold fixed the other kind of structural features of the endeavor and say whether or not you continue to try will make the decisive difference in whether or not you succeed. And so his thought is that's the question of whether you ought to persist, whether it's rational to persist in some difficult action in the face of uncertainty, depends on whether the outcome is up to you. if it is, if this is something that's up to you, to the extent that it's up to you, then it's a practical question, meaning it should be settled by practical reasoning rather than theoretical reasoning. In other words, Marusic's idea is that you shouldn't take the evidence in this case, if it's up to you, and make a prediction about what's likely to happen. You should decide whether or not to keep going based on considerations that favor the action, such as, publishing in a top journal will, further my career and help me get a job, and I can rub it in the face of my grad school arch rival, whatever it is, whatever practical reasons bear on the case, those are the ones that you should appeal to in deciding whether or not to persist, and those are going to ground the rationality of persistence. On the other hand, if it's not up to you, if it's more akin to a lottery, then what you ought to do is essentially the expected utility calculation. You should look at the evidence and let that play a decisive role in your determination of whether to go on. Okay. So I think that's inadequate, at least insofar as this view essentially sets up a dichotomy that I think doesn't deal sufficiently with the complexity of a lot of cases that kind of lie in between something being purely up to you and being akin to a lottery. All right, so it's a dichotomy, not just because there are kind of two possibilities here, but because depending on your answer to whether a certain action is up to you or not, you're going to use a different kind of reasoning to decide whether or not to persist. If it's up to you, you use practical reasoning, and if it's not up to you, you use theoretical reasoning. Okay, but there are going to be a lot of cases, I think, where precisely part of what you're uncertain about is whether or not the action is up to you. Whether or not your abilities and your persistence will settle what will happen, or whether you're going to face discrimination, prejudice, other kinds of obstacles along the way that, no matter what your abilities are, they won't suffice to enable you to achieve your goal. All right, so let's look at a different kind of case. Consider Jack, a student growing up in a high poverty neighborhood, attending a high poverty school. He's a serious student intending to earn a four-year college degree, but only 25% of the students at his high school even graduate high school. His school doesn't offer AP courses or prepare students well for college level courses. His family doesn't have the resources to send him to SAT prep courses or to pay for college. Few of his classmates will make it to college, and those who do mostly attend the local community college. Even fewer will transfer to a four-year school or graduate from one. And so a question facing Jack is whether to continue to pursue this goal of getting a four-year college degree. I suggest that he's not in a position yet to know whether it's up to him to get a college degree. The evidence that he has is quite unfavorable for other agents like him in his situation. And the cause of his doubt isn't primarily that he himself won't have the ability, exactly, but having the ability in this kind of case partly depends on having resources, to take these prep classes and, essentially develop your abilities in the ways that your competitors will be able to do. And so it's a very complex case. And I think this dichotomy of, whether it's up to you or not doesn't fit well with Jack's kind of case. We need something in between. Right? And so this is the part where I think there is a bit of a connection to conceptual engineering, not directly, but I do want to suggest that we need to reframe how we're thinking about the central question here. Right? I think the Marusic's framing in terms of whether something is up to you or not leads us to elicit either one kind of justification or another. Either you can elicit a practical justification for persistence, or you can elicit a theoretical justification, but it essentially rules out that you can elicit a cluster of justifications in answer to this question that cut across the practical theoretical divide. And so I think the way that Marusic has set it up is problematic, and we need to reframe the central question that's going to help us get a different kind of consideration or different kinds of considerations in view. All right, and so what I'm going to suggest is that we should think about this in terms of doing enough. And I don't mean to say that this is somehow a magic slogan that will, solve all of our problems. But what I want to suggest is that the question facing the agent concerns how much she needs to do in pursuit of the goal before she arrives at a position where giving up is consistent in some sense with what she set out to do. It's consistent with her commitment or with how she herself conceived of like what was required of her. How much is enough? How much do you need to do before it's reasonable to give up and say, I've done enough. I've done enough. I've given enough to this marriage. I've put in I've done what I could. So what the reframing allows us to do is ask in an open-ended way, what kinds of considerations can ground claims of the form, I didn't do enough, I gave up too soon, I should have done more. Now, one nice thing about this very open-ended way of framing the question facing the agent is that I do think it can capture what's right, in my view, about Marusic's approach, which is that if you know that some action truly is up to you, right? It's truly up to you whether or not you finish the race. Nobody's going to prevent you. You have the physical fitness to, allow you to be able to do it. It's just up to you whether or not you persist or whether or not you give up. In that kind of case, then giving up is necessarily premature, absent a change of mind. So unless you actually change your mind about what your goal is, if you think that the only thing standing in your way of achieving the goal is your own persistence, such that success is solely a matter of continuing to try, then it is necessarily a failure of your own agency to give up. And we can say you gave up too soon. And so I do think that's the insight. When an action is truly up to you and known to be so, then we can conceive of it in the way that Marusic suggests. But I think then when there's uncertainty about whether the action is up to you, different kinds of considerations come into view. Okay. So let me sharpen now what I think the puzzle is here, and why I think there's something really interesting to be done philosophically. So suppose first that the agent's intention can be described as simply to do A. Okay, so suppose my intention is to finish my manuscript within the next month. And that's how I would characterize it. That's how I would express it to others. My intention is to get it done. And then suppose I don't do it. I don't finish my manuscript. For whatever reason, it might fall into any of the 4 categories that I outlined in the beginning. If I don't do it, and I haven't changed my mind about my goal, then there's a kind of straightforward discrepancy. There's nothing mysterious about where the gap could lie between what the goal was and my execution. My goal was to finish my manuscript by the end of the month. I didn't do it. I fell short of the success conditions that were specified by the content of my intention, which was to succeed in doing A. So that kind of case, I think, is not very puzzling. On the other hand, at least arguably, uncertainty about whether you'll be able to A prevents you from simply intending to do A. Maybe, some people think it kind of conceptually prevents you from having that intention, or you might think more moderately that you could, but it's kind of irrational. If you have doubt about whether you'll be able to A, then kind of what you ought to intend is something less than all out Aing. You can intend to try to A or to take steps towards Aing, right? But there's the possibility that you may fall short of actually accomplishing A will at least often be built in to your representation of what you're committed to, what you intend to do. All right, and certainly that's how we would express such intentions or plans to others. We would say, look, I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish my manuscript in the next month, but I intend to try, something like that. But if that's the content of your intention, if your representation of what you're committed to doing kind of falls short of actually achieving A, then it's no longer the case that there's sort of ipso facto a discrepancy between goal and execution if you give up before accomplishing A, right? Because that already was built in, that you might well give up. that you might not be able to accomplish the goal. And so now there's work to be done to try to understand where that gap could arise. What are you committed to that falls short of actually accomplishing A, relative to which you could give up too soon, right? You could fail to accomplish that thing that falls short of doing A, but somehow lies in the middle here, such that you could fall short of doing it, right? So that, I think, is the philosophical puzzle. What is this kind of, what is the commitment? What is the content or the success conditions of the agent's action representation in these cases, such that she could fall short of doing that thing, but where it can't simply be falling short of doing A. All right, so that's the question that I just posed. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, then, I'm going to look at some possible answers to that question. So the first thing I want to do is look at the concept of trying. Trying is the word that we normally use in these situations. The form of the expression of the intention often adverts to trying. So perhaps it's the case that the very idea of what it is to try, what it is to successfully try, will help give us a grip on the standard that could be doing the work here. The second place I want to look is in the content of the agent's plans in these cases, including her backup plans for what to do when she encounters obstacles or fails in her initial plan. I think both of these ideas help us make some progress, but they're not going to give us complete answers to the question that we're asking. And so the third and fourth things I want to look at in the last part of the talk are what I'll call degrees of commitment and character. And essentially what I want to argue is that we need to appeal to factors like 3 and 4 to get a complete answer to our question of what it means to have done enough by your own lights and what it means to fall short of that standard. It's not going to be enough just to look at the specific content of the agent's plans in this particular case. We're going to have to look more generally at something like commitment and character. Okay, so first let's dig into trying. So the idea here again is that, I would express my intention in cases of uncertainty by appeal to trying. I would say, I'm going to try to finish my manuscript in the next month. So what does it mean to have successfully done that, right? When have I succeeded at trying? The problem here, I think, is that trying is a very slippery concept. I think there are lots and lots of different senses of trying that we could be interested in. One sense is what I'll call the anemic sense of trying. And what I mean by this is that, according to the anemic sense, you've tried as soon as you've done anything at all in service of the goal, right? So think of a teenager who, you ask them to clean up their room and they kind of throw one shirt into the laundry and then they're like, oh, I tried. It's a very, very thin sense. And it's not the one that the parents usually have in mind in this kind of case. But I think there is a legitimate sense in which you've tried to do A as soon as you've done anything at all in service of that goal. And some philosophers have sort of defended accounts on which this is the primary sense of trying. Gideon Yaffe, for instance, in his book on criminal attempts, presupposes that this is all that's required in order to have tried. Okay, and so relative to this very anemic sense of trying, you cannot give up too soon, I think, unless you don't try at all. As soon as you've done anything at all, then you have successfully tried. Maybe, you can try to go for a walk, even if your legs are paralyzed by, doing whatever you would normally do to will your legs to move. Even if they don't move, you can say, oh, I tried to go for a walk. It turned out that my legs were paralyzed. Okay, so that anemic sense isn't going to help us, right? I think that's not the notion that we're interested in. That's not what most agents take themselves to be committed to when they embark on these difficult actions and at least want to succeed in having tried. This is not enough. So maybe there's a more substantive notion, and we could call it really trying. Like, I'm really going to try to get that manuscript finished. I'm really going to try to complete the race. So maybe there's a more substantive reading that's going to give us what we need. Now, some philosophers have glossed the substantive reading of trying as a matter of doing what you can. This is Hornsby, in 2010 in a handbook entry on what trying is. She argues that trying is a matter of doing what you can to do A. And Avery Archer follows Hornsby in this. Sergio Tenenbaum, in his recent book, describes it as doing one's best to A in these circumstances. And these are very natural readings. I mean, I think it would be very natural to say, I'm going to do my best to finish the manuscript, or I'm going to do whatever I can. So let's think a little bit about that. What exactly does that come to? Sorry, I'm going to put a big chunk of text on the screen, which is annoying, but this is from Hornsby's article, and I think it's really helpful to see what she has in mind when she says, trying is a matter of doing what you can. So she says, here is a pair of stories which help to confirm the idea that to try to fly is to do what one can to fly. So imagine Adrian walking to the office one morning. When he's halfway there, he finds that the street is cordoned off. There's a bomb scare, and he's told that the campus is inaccessible. He tried to get to the office, but he had to turn back. In the second story, things are the same to the halfway point, but now there's no bomb scare. It's rather that Adrian decides that he would be better off going to the library on the other side of town, so he turns around and walks in the opposite direction. Even here, Adrian was trying to get to the office until he turned back, but in this case, he did not try to get to the office. So Hornsby's suggestion here is that it can be the case that you were trying, but you didn't end up having tried. The stories help to confirm the idea that to try to fly is to do what you can to fly, in as much as Adrian did what he could to get to the office in the first version, but not in the second, where he could have continued his journey. So what should we make of this idea? Well, I think doing enough can't amount to literally doing everything that you can. And maybe this is not what Hornsby has in mind, but notice, I mean, there are lots of things that Adrian could have done in the first scenario. He could have murdered the police officer telling him he had to turn around. He could have traded his most valuable possessions in order to get through the barricade. There were lots of things that he could have done, but that, of course, would be inconsistent with his moral obligations, with his other commitments and values, right? There are prices that are too high to pay in order to keep going to accomplish a particular goal. So it can't be the case. So when we say doing what you can, we have some modal notion in mind that's not just a matter of anything within your power, right? That's not a plausible reading. It seems as though implicitly there's some constraints coming in and ruling out certain options, such that Hornsby thinks we should say in the first case that Adrian did what he could to get to his office, even though he didn't commit any acts of violence or pay an exorbitant price to get there. So something is coming in and helping to specify success conditions of having tried in this sense, having done what you could. That's not given by the very concept of trying, I think, or the very idea of doing what you can. Something else is doing that work. And so essentially, these act descriptions, doing what you can, doing your best, don't fully specify success conditions on their own. And we're going to need an account of where these other constraints intuitively come from, such that you can count as having tried, even if you don't commit murder, and so forth. So I don't want to suggest that that's impossible. I think that's a philosophical project that we could embark on. But my main point right now is that we don't yet have an answer. We don't yet have an account. And appeal to trying, glossed as doing what you can or doing your best, isn't helpful without some further account of how those notions are constrained by, again, the agent's other commitments and values and so forth. Okay, so now let's look at the agent's plans. A plan to try to do A will usually involve, it's going to be more than just kind of that bare representation, I'm going to try. There's going to be much more specific content in our plans about the means to pursue, what kinds of alternatives you might pursue if your initial plans don't work out. You might have some backup plans to deal with contingencies that arise. So there's going to be a whole structure. There's going to be content to the primary plan. There, in many cases, are going to be backup plans that help kind of bolster the agent's overall blueprint for how to go forward. Okay, and so one thing that we can say about doing enough is that you have to at least carry out all of the, everything that's specified by your plan to try, unless you change your mind. Of course, you can give up on your plan to try. And then now we've fallen into one of the other categories that we're not investigating. But as long as we sort of continue to have the goal, right, then at least you need to do everything that you plan to do or change your mind. Okay, so that's a first answer to the question. You haven't done enough if you fail to complete the plan that you have in mind without changing it. But one thing to notice is that our plans will typically be partial. It's very rare that we're going to have a complete blueprint for every contingency, especially when we're sort of pursuing these goals in the face of a lot of uncertainty about what the future will hold. It wouldn't even make sense to try to fill in the plan in every detail. I've been talking about finishing a manuscript within the next month, but having a plan for how to keep your marriage alive for the next 40 years, or how exactly to finish writing your dissertation and receive your PhD, it wouldn't be reasonable to fill in every detail and have a complete plan for every contingency. Rather, we rely on ourselves to fill in our plans over time and deal with new problems and new information as they arise. And so the point is just that our plans will typically be partial. And what that means is that having completed everything that's specified in your plan to try will not necessarily answer the question of whether you've done enough. The question can always arise again. You've kind of done everything that you had thought of initially, or that you've tried every option that you think is available to you to accomplish your goal. And now you've run out of ideas. The question of whether to persevere still faces you, because you could try to think of more ideas. You could make new plans. There's more you could do in that situation if you decide to. And so even in the absence of a fully determinate plan of when and how to go forward, the question of whether you've done enough can still arise. So my suggestion here is that plans are going to be a really important part of the story, but it doesn't completely answer the question, because even if you've done everything you plan to do, as long as you think you could keep going, there's more that you could try. You could seek out advice about new plans to make. You still face a choice about whether to give up and whether you've done enough. Okay. So the basic suggestion is that we need something that goes beyond the explicit content of the agent's plans in any particular case, including whatever content is imposed by the very idea of trying or really trying. So we need to go beyond the agent's plans. And here again, I'm going to divide this into two categories: the thing that goes beyond the specific content of the agent's plans. I think on the one hand, we can talk about the volitional aspects of sort of how to understand what the agent is committed to in these cases. And we can talk about the dispositional aspects. I'm going to call the former commitment, and I'm going to call the latter character. Okay, let me just say a couple of things, though, about how I'm using these terms, because these are both very controversial terms or over-theorized terms. And so when I talk about character, I mean character very broadly, to include epistemic, aesthetic, and other kinds of dispositions, as well as practical dispositions. So how you respond to evidence in any particular case can be part of your character, as I'll go on to say more about in a moment. And I also don't mean to be committed to a notion of character that's somehow already packaged for ethical evaluation, right? So I'm not committed to the idea that we need to understand certain character traits as virtuous or vicious, such that they can be evaluated as ethically good or bad, irrespective of context. Okay, so I want to kind of disavow some of those readings of character and just think more generally about certain dispositions that we might have to respond to questions and situations in a particular way. Okay, so first I want to look at degrees of commitment. This is a controversial notion, and I think a lot of models of kind of the attitudes that feature in planning try not to appeal to something called degrees of commitment, right? We try to appeal to beliefs and desires and intentions, right? Some people even try to do away with intention and just do, make good with beliefs and desires. But it's considered sort of unparsimonious, I think, to appeal to something called degrees of commitment that go beyond those attitudes. But I think we need to do it. I think we need it as part of the story. And I think this focus on understanding when an agent has lived up to her own standards needs to have this idea of how committed are you to achieving this goal? Are you really strongly committed to your marriage or only weakly committed? Are you really strongly committed to getting a PhD, or is this just something that, you're giving it a shot? And I think this is something that we need in our model. So I have a lot to say about how to think about degrees of commitment, or rather how not to think about it. I do think there are some accounts of the psychology of agency that make room for something called partial intentions. And I think that initially seems like a promising place to look to understand degrees of commitment. We can talk about how partial your intention is. But as a matter of fact, I think the accounts that exist either are problematic or are getting at something different. They're not getting at the kind of thing that I want to get at. A lot of accounts of partial intention essentially are thinking that the partiality of the intention derives from the agent's doubt about whether she'll be able to succeed. And so it's sort of making an intention partial in virtue of the uncertainty that that the agent faces. But what I want to get at is the notion that's orthogonal to uncertainty, such that an agent who's uncertain about whether or not she'll be able to succeed in her goal could still be really strongly committed, right? Imagine, the activist who thinks there's almost no chance that she and her fellow activists will be able to bring about the end of racialized injustice in the United States, and yet she's very strongly committed to that goal and does everything she can in service of it. Or on the other hand, you can have a very high expectation of success and be only weakly committed. Maybe I'm really good at throwing paper balls in the trash can, and so I think I'm probably going to succeed if I try to do that right now, but I'm not committed to making sure it happens if I miss the first time. And so the idea is that I'm trying to get at a notion of commitment that's orthogonal to how certain you are about whether you'll be able to succeed. So I'm just going to skip over all the negative stuff I have to say about how not to think of degrees of commitment. Instead, I think we should essentially follow an account that I find really congenial, which was initially offered to us by Cheshire Calhoun in a paper from 2009. And she talks about active commitment to an intention or goal in terms of policies and efforts that the agent adopts or undertakes to maintain the persistence of an intention or goal. And what she has in mind is that, again, we run into these moments where we've tried to accomplish our goal. It's not working out, right? Our paper's getting rejected from the top journal. I'm facing a lot of writer's block, and I just kind of can't make any progress on this manuscript. My marriage is feeling stale, whatever it is. And you are feeling, you have low morale, you're uncertain about success, you've run out of ideas. What are you going to do in those moments? Are you inclined to take steps to bolster the persistence of your intention? Or are you sort of going to refrain from such things and just let it peter out? Okay, and so here's Calhoun. She says a commitment is both an intention to engage with something, a person, a relationship, a goal, activity, identity, etc., and a preparedness to see to it that the intention to engage persists. Seeing to the persistence of an intention comes in degrees. One may be prepared to do more or less to sustain one's intention to engage, and we can measure the depth of commitment by what a person is prepared to do or to resist in order to see to it that the intention to engage persists. So I find this account really congenial. And so the idea is that there's the intention on the one hand, which is going to have whatever content it has about, what you're going to do in service of the goal. And then outside of that intention is all this other stuff that's active, that involves further things you can do to kind of reinvigorate your intention when the chips are down, or otherwise kind of try to make sure that it keeps going rather than petering out. Okay, I'll come back to that idea in a second. What's the other part of the story? So I think it would be a mistake to model this entirely in volitional terms. I think sometimes we undertake commitments in a very active way, and we're very reflective and self-conscious about sort of being more or less committed to some goal or pursuit, and deliberate about the things that we're prepared to do to ensure that the intention persists. But in other cases, it's not accurate to talk about these things in active or volitional terms. Sometimes it's more dispositional and maybe not even something that the agent ever reflected about or deliberated about. And so here I'm taking inspiration from Joseph Raz in a paper, sort of When We Are Most Ourselves. He talks about character traits being in part formed by the fact that we tend one way or another when reason is indecisive. So he has in mind, right at the beginning of the talk, I suggested that sometimes our evidence is either indeterminate or permissive, or both, right? It might permit more than one reasonable response. Maybe given this body of evidence, it would be reasonable to believe that P, or it might be reasonable to withhold belief, or maybe even believe that not P. All right, and so he's interested, and analogously, we might think that there's practical underdetermination. It seems as though there might be cases in which your reasons for action don't uniquely tell you what you need to do. It would be permissible, to stay and care for your sick mother, and it would also be permissible to go and fight in the French resistance. And you might think the reasons in this case don't tell you which way you have to go. And Raz is interested in the ways in which character can play a role in filling in the gap here when the reasons run out. So here's a passage from this paper. This is from 2002, and he's specifically interested in the evidence in this kind of case rather than the practical reasons, but I think it clearly applies in both directions. He says there's latitude in the space of reasons, both for action and for belief. There are many cases in which there are reasons to believe a proposition which are not decisive. And in such cases, just as our choices, when underdetermined by reason, reveal our character and tastes, so do our beliefs. Whether or not we believe something when neither belief nor withholding it would be irrational can show us to be suspicious, indecisive, envious, trusting, naive, and so on. One thing I like about this passage is that I think there's a duality here. We both reveal our character and our tastes in these moments, but we also form our character in these moments. Right? There's a kind of ongoing diachronic process here where the way in which you respond to indeterminacy determines who you are, but then also kind of helps explain how you're going to go on. And so here the idea is that, the question of whether or not you should persist in some attempt, might come down to whether or not, something about your character, whether or not your character is itself optimistic, persistent, gritty, something like that, or whether you have a different kind of character, which is very cautious and risk averse and pessimistic. Okay, and that might determine both how you respond to the evidence bearing on the likelihood of success, but also just more generally, kind of what it means to have lived up to your own standard of what you should do in these moments when you're just really uncertain about what will come of your continued efforts. Okay, so I know that went by pretty quickly, and I'm sure there's a lot more to say, but I want to now take these ideas and apply them back specifically to despair, where I'm using the word despair is probably a little bit extreme insofar as it has the connotation of having this emotional component, but I mean more generally these moments when you're very uncertain about what you'll be able to achieve, and you're considering the possibility of giving up because you think this is never going to work out. Even if I continue to try, I'm never going to finish this book. I'm never going to be a track star. So how might these notions of commitment and character help us understand how to deal with those with those moments of despair? Well, I want to take Calhoun's idea and take it a little bit further than anything she explicitly says. I think she isn't as focused on how to deal with evidence, I suppose, as I am. So I want to say, look, the extent of your commitment or persistence of character can be measured in part by your resistance to premature despair. Okay, and so let me spell out what I mean by that. Insofar as you're weakly committed to some goal, or insofar as you have a cautious, risk-averse character, right, then, it might be that it makes sense to be very sensitive to evidence that suggests that you are likely to fail, right? Such that kind of as soon as it starts seeming to you like this isn't going to work out, the evidence is not very felicitous, right? It might make sense to go ahead and despair and give up, right? And such that in those cases, you've done enough relative to the rather weak extent of your commitment or the kind of character that you bring into these endeavors. There's no imperative to be especially resistant to despair. On the other hand, if you're strongly committed, or if your character is, adventurous and, risk-seeking and ambitious, I don't know, fill in exactly how we want to describe it, then I want to say you should be resistant to premature despair. You want to kind of go as far as you can before you come to the conclusion that this isn't going to work out. So you want to be resilient, as I have said in earlier work, in these moments. Okay, so I think we can say now that that's part of how we understand the strength of your commitment or, the orientation of your character in these situations. It can be measured by your resistance to premature despair. But, and this is the part that I really want to emphasize, and going back to why I think the Marusic approach is inadequate in the kinds of cases that I'm most interested in. It's really important to emphasize that this doesn't mean that we should ignore the evidence that we might fail viewed predictably. So one way to be resistant to premature despair is just, again, to ignore the evidence or refuse to make any predictions using the evidence and just turn a blind eye or otherwise, like, don't do that calculation. But I think that's a real mistake. And I think it's not just a mistake kind of for independent reasons. I think it would be a mistaken way to understand the very ideas of being strongly committed or having a persistent character. So here are some ways that attention to the evidence, I think, is important for underwriting the strength of your commitment. So for example, we've mentioned the idea of backup planning a couple of times. Attending to evidence of possible failure, I think, is essential to make sense of backup planning. If you expect to succeed, then it would be irrational to make significant investments in a backup plan for failure, right? Because you don't seriously think that situation is going to arise. And yet, making a backup plan for cases of failure can help us expand the scope of the risks that we're willing to accept. So what I mean by this is, suppose you're pursuing a PhD, all right? If you fail and you drop out of the program, the worry is that you're left with nothing. You have to start over in your late 20s or late 30s, whatever it is, and all your peers are well on their way to retirement, and here you can spell out the worst case scenario. Putting in place a backup plan for the possibility of failure, such that now you have this plan to go be a bartender in Amsterdam, and you think that would be a really great life too. It can help you keep going, right, with respect to the PhD, because failure is no longer as bad as it was without the backup plan. So these things are connected. Making a backup plan for the case of failure actually can underwrite the strength of your commitment to the primary plan. And I can't make sense of how to do that without attending to evidence viewed predictably, right? The evidence about whether you're likely to succeed in your primary goal. Second, in the cases where you're uncertain about what's up to you, one thing that happens along the way as you're pursuing the goal, encountering setbacks, having some successes, you're learning. There's a kind of inquiry involved in this kind of this striving agency. We go along and we learn more about which things are up to us and which things are structural impediments. You might start out thinking whether or not I succeed in graduate school is entirely up to how hard I work on writing papers and so forth. But then, I mean, kind of sadly, you might learn about your particular program that your advisor is really sexist, and so it's never going to give you a fair shot. And that might be something that comes to factor in your understanding of, you know, what it would mean to give up. Like, what kind of failure would it be? Would it be a failure of your own persistence, or would it be a response to kind of structural injustices in your situation? And so, you know, as I said earlier, I'm very interested in this kind of retrospective, you know, we have to make decisions in the moment about whether to give up or whether to go on, but we also, like, the significance of those decisions for kind of how the rest of our life unfolds and how we understand the narrative of it, right? It really matters whether you think of yourself as having given up because you didn't have what it takes, or you didn't have the willpower to keep going, as opposed to responding to major obstacles, right, that were imposed on you by your circumstances. And so, again, I think we have to attend to the evidence precisely in order to get more information about this distinction between what's up to you and what's not. And that's, again, not independent of our understanding of the meaning of having done enough. Okay, and then third, I want to suggest that requiring an abundance of evidence, one way or the other, about like how this is going to go and what's going to happen if you keep persisting, can manifest a stronger commitment. You want to be really sure before you give up. You want to be really sure that, you know, more hard work isn't going to change things, or whatever. You want to run more races before you're convinced that you're never going to be fast enough to, you know, compete at the national level. And so it might be, and again, this is evidence viewed predictively, you might really require that precisely in order to manifest a strong commitment to achieving the goal, such that there's no uncertainty later, or very little uncertainty about, I've set things up so there has to be some uncertainty left over. But when you look back at this decision later, that kind of uncertainty is going to haunt you less, to the extent that you made sure you really got as much evidence as you could before making that decision. And so I don't mean this list to be exhaustive. I'm just trying to make the case that to understand these notions of commitment and character, it's really important that we take the evidence into account as evidence. And so the idea that somehow in these moments we should only use practical reasoning to decide what to do, I think really overlooks this side of the story. Okay, and so I'll just tie this back to, you know, I said in the beginning that there's a kind of bigger picture at work here. And let me just say a little bit about how the story I've tried to tell today kind of fits into the bigger picture. So Jennifer Morton and I have argued in earlier work that grit or persistence involves a kind of epistemic resilience, meaning something like, you know, a strongly committed agent should have a high bar for what counts as sufficient evidence before she concludes that this is never going to happen, even if she continues to try. So she should have a high bar such that she requires more evidence than an observer might before she's ready to despair. But we didn't have anything to say really about what the connection is between commitment and epistemic resilience, like why the notion of commitment changes things for the agent. And so the story that I've tried to tell here is meant to supplement this idea that now we see what the relationship is between being strongly committed and being more epistemically resilient to negative evidence, right? Whereas a weak commitment might not require much epistemic resilience at all, right? And so our view is not that somehow in every case where you undertake to do something difficult, you need to be epistemically resilient, or, you know, that grit necessarily involves this kind of resilience, but rather that we measure the depth of commitment in part by how much resilience the agent is disposed to exhibit. So that's just to kind of show how this story fits into a larger project. Okay, and so now let me just end the talk by trying to say what I have and haven't, argued for here, and what I take the answer to my initial question to be, at least partially. Okay, so the question I posed at the beginning of the talk was this: in virtue of what might it be the case in, in the kinds of examples that we're investigating, that an agent gave up prematurely, such that there's a sense in which she should have kept going. She should have exerted more effort to achieve her goal. So I've argued against the idea, first, that this question should only be settled by appeal to the evidence. Okay, so I don't think that it's just a matter of looking at the odds, right? And I've tried to say what I think is problematic about that. I've argued that the question shouldn't be settled without appeal to the evidence. At least, there might be special cases where something is completely up to you and you know it. And in that kind of case, it might be that Marusic's approach, where you only think about the practical reasons in favor of persistence, it might be that that is appropriate in those cases. But when there's uncertainty about whether something is up to you, then I think you have to be looking at the evidence, right, for all kinds of reasons. All right, and then I also have tried to argue that, we might have thought that the extent of what the agent should do before it's reasonable for her to give up is completely specified by the content of her plans, whatever it is that she kind of had in mind when she set out to accomplish this goal. And I try to argue that that's an important part of the story, but that's not the end of the story, that there can be more to it, such that you can do everything that you plan to do and still fail to have done enough by your own lights relative to your own standards. Okay, and so I think we need the notions of commitment and character to help explain, again, what the agent should do by her own lights when the reasons underdetermine what she rationally must do, right? And if you're really strongly committed, then you need to do more before you've done enough than if you're weakly committed. Okay, and then I haven't said very much about this, but I do want to suggest in the end that an important part of the story, and this is where I'm really in agreement with Marusic, our account should make sense of the idea that the agent's perspective on this question can reasonably differ from that of the observer, that the agent's perspective is somehow privileged in virtue of the fact that she is the agent and that it's her efforts that will make the difference. And I want to say that's right, but it's not because the agent is somehow limited to the practical perspective, whereas the observer is allowed to make predictions, but rather it's the fact that the agent's commitments and character are not only revealed by what she does in these moments, but also constituted by such choices, right? And so it's not, I don't mean to have suggested that there's going to be some fact of the matter, maybe at that moment when you decide to get married or enter the PhD program or write a book or whatever it is. It's not as though I think there's a fact of the matter at the very beginning of this endeavor about how strong your commitment is and what exactly it's going to take to have done enough, right? But where you're open to the idea that you may need to give up. Rather, this is something that will evolve as you go on and will be partly determined by encountering these moments of despair. And so the strength of your commitment will be constituted in some cases by what you do, whether you decide to persist or to give up in these cases. And so I think that helps to explain why the agent's perspective can reasonably differ. Okay, and that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.